Here's showcasing the Nextorage Japan 4 terabyte NVMe SSD drive. This is a 2280 M2 drive, and you could use it as an expansion drive for your PlayStation 5 if you have the version with the heatsink. Now, I got this drive to test from Newegg, and I'd like to thank Newegg and Nextorage Japan for sending me this drive to test, but I wanted to show you how it would install in the PlayStation 5, but I did not get the version with the heatsink, so I had to buy a heatsink separately, but I'm just going to show you where it goes in the PS5 and where you would put it in should you get the version with the heatsink. I did wind up using this drive for my son's latest computer build because he had 3 open NVMe slots on his motherboard, which I'll show the testing later in the video for that. But here's what the stick looks like, and again, this is 4 terabytes NVMe M2 stick. This has fast enough read and write speeds to work as a PlayStation 5 storage drive. Ultra fast. They say it can do up to 7,000 megabytes per second read and 6,000, just around 6,000 megabytes per second write. We will test those speeds later with my PC, but I'm just showing you what the stick looks like, and then we're going to go show you where it installs in the PlayStation 5 if you want to actually add the extra storage to PS5. But again, you need the version with the heatsink. You have to buy a heatsink separately to put it in the PS5. So to install an extra storage drive in your PlayStation 5, all you need to do is place your PlayStation 5 on its back with the disc facing away from you, the power outlet on the left side. You'll pull the panel at the back left up and slide it down. So after you get your cover plate off the PlayStation 5, the M2 slot is clearly visible right here. All you need is a small, thin, fine-tipped Phillips head screwdriver to access it, and then you simply open it up and you would slide your M2 slot in. The M2 slot in only goes in one way. Just make sure it lines up, and you see it has a screw hole where you would attach the screw that would hold your M2 slot down. Make sure your M2 SSD has a heatsink, because a heatsink is required. These M2 SSDs do get really hot when you're doing a lot of read and write operations on them, and I'm going to show you in this test later with the PC that the temperature does rise on this SSD, so you do want to have a heatsink on the SSD, and it's even recommended that you have a heatsink on it even if you use it in your PC, although a PC generally can have a lot more airflow and it's more tolerant of not having a heatsink on it in a PC, but it is recommended that you have its heatsink anyway. But again, here's how it looks in the slot. You would have a heatsink on it, and then you just simply screw it in. Now, I took this Nextorage Japan M2 SSD and I put it in my son's brand new motherboard in his new NZXT computer, and I ran through his paces with Crystal Disk Mark as well as with Crystal Disk Monitor to just basically show how it runs. I was very impressed with the fact that this is one of the fastest SSDs that I've ever tested, way faster than my Western Digital SSD that I have in my primary computer itself. I was getting 6157 megabytes per second read speeds with the standard tests, and of course the write speed was a little higher. I wound up repeating the tests, and they still wound up being extremely good. I never quite hit the 7,000 read speeds with the Crystal Mark tests, but I was pretty close to the speeds to say that this is definitely a next generation SSD and was lightning fast. The one thing I did notice about it is when it was doing the sequential operations and it was writing, especially when you go multiple sequential writes, and then I also put the size of the file from 1 gigabyte in the tests to 8 gigabytes in the tests, I was watching the temperature of the drive ride up to as high as 70 degrees Celsius. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it is highly recommended you have a heatsink. Now, 70 degrees Celsius is about the upper limit that won't have any issues, and you can see I hit 67 degrees Celsius at this point in the testing, but it does go up to 70 degrees Celsius when I increase the amount of data being written when I was doing subsequent tests. So just note, if you're not going to be constantly reading, writing, churning from it, you're probably fine if you have a good airflow in your case to not have a heatsink, but it's still recommended you get a separate heatsink, or Nextorage Japan sells the version with the heatsink, so I recommend getting the version with the heatsink just to help prevent those temperatures from climbing into the very high temperature range, which could, of course, impact the lifespan of the drive itself. So other than that, the drive is absolutely excellent, fantastic, lightning fast, 4 terabytes of storage. This is supreme for installing and playing games on, doing video editing, writing, anything you need to do with rendering. It just is a great option, and the fact that it has fast enough speeds that it qualifies and is certified to work on the PlayStation 5 is a great option. So if you're looking for an ultra-fast M2 2280 SSD drive, the Nextorage Japan is a good option for you. I recommend getting the version with the heatsink.